Hello, I'm Mark Norman, the creator and host of the Folklore Podcast. Welcome to another episode of the Folklore Podcast Book Club. Today it's my pleasure to speak to author Roger Clarke about his book, A Natural History of Ghosts, a book which the Sunday Times called beautifully written, lithe, complicated, and hugely rewarding. Enjoy the episode. Roger, thank you so much for taking the time to join me and talk about your fascinating book. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you for having me.
No problem at all. So your book, A Natural History of Ghosts, yes, I bought this from a bookshop who didn't have those stickers that you can peel off without leaving a mark.
Yes, why do they do that? Yes.
No, naming no names, but yes, horrible. This is, let's be honest, a book that any self-respecting ghost researcher or even folklore researcher ought to have on their shelf. I'm pleased to say I've had it on my shelf for a number of years. And it is a book that I know you always wanted to write. I mean, you say yourself, you've had quite a rich and varied writing career. You've written film writing for The Independent, and other publications. You've had fiction published with Pan Horror and Fontana.
Yeah.
From a very early age, in fact, didn't you?
Yes, from the age of 16. And if I learned to read and write at 5, so I published a ghost story in Pan within 10 years of learning to read. So
it's pretty impressive.
I just didn't realise that, actually.
Yeah. But you had a pretty impressive person, on your side for that, didn't you, as well?
Oh, you mean Roald Dahl?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, I didn't know him through any sort of family means or professionally. I just wrote him a fan letter, and he corresponded with me a bit, and he wrote me this wonderful letter, which I still have, which is handwritten, and it tells you how to write a short story. It's like one page in his handwriting, and what Hemingway taught him. And the art of writing is rewriting. Anyway, it's one of my favorite things that I own. And then but some of his responses were a bit tetchy because he was kind of like that. It's fine. And then I sold a story to Pan, and then I sent a subsequent third story to both Pan and Fontana, and they both accepted it. And I was in trouble, and so I wrote to him, and he immediately asked his agent to intervene. So it was great because I was a very unhappy teenager. I was suffering from illness and depression. And so everything was going into my writing, and this was just such an amazing validation of who I was and my imaginative process and my escape from being bullied at school, and suddenly these amazing people were taking me seriously. So
yeah, it really was a fantastic start, wasn't it, to have for a writing career? But despite all that, this book, Natural History of Ghosts, is the book that you said you always wanted to write. Now, tell us why that is.
I know that's such a sort of terrible cliche, but it actually does happen to be true. And basically, I lost my job at The Independent. I was writing film interviews and three columns a week at one point, and I lost my job during one of the many contractions of the broadsheet market, and I didn't really know what to do. And I met an old friend who was a publisher, and we met at a Chinese restaurant, had dim sum, and I went through 10 ideas I should write, and this was the 10th idea. But I said it to him as an afterthought because the title, A Natural History of Ghosts, came to me at that actual instant. And I said, oh yeah, this is crazy, but there's this last idea I had, because all of them were very sort of predicated on my career as a film journalist. And so it was just a kind of curveball, crazy idea that came into my head. This title, A Natural History of Ghosts, came into my head, and I just said it. And he said, yeah, that's it. That's it. And And this is why I'm particularly attached to the title of the book. And I had a sort of falling out with my American publisher who wanted to change the title, and I have a sort of totemistic attachment to the title. I feel it was like a gift from whoever, whatever. And everything just fell into place. I wrote it, and it all just came together. As a child, I grew up in a haunted house, and then as a teenager, we moved to an even more haunted house. And so I so I kind of grew up in this atmosphere of haunted houses, and I was just very obsessed with ghosts and everything from a very early age, but more, not just ghost paranormal stuff, but sort of folklore, which was, and to some extent I am and remain a folklorist. I'm not really all that interested in proving whether ghosts exist. I think we've come to the point where it's actually irrelevant whether they exist or not. And I discuss photography and things like that. I just don't. I'm not sure that that's what's interesting about ghosts. I think I wanted to write a book about ghost stories where the most interesting thing weren't the ghosts, which is always assumed, but the people. Yeah, the people who see the ghosts. What happens to them, and what happens after the ghost stories? What happens when everything closes down, everyone goes home, the crowds go home, the courtiers from Charles I court go home, or whatever, Charles II. What happens then? How does and I thought, that's actually what's interesting. And I also wanted to write a book where I didn't ever say whether I believed in ghosts or not, because I half believe and I half don't, which I think is what most people are like. Yes, I kind of want to believe, but I've never seen one, and I still want to believe. And so I have various answers when people say, do you believe in ghosts? I say sometimes, occasionally, or I say, my heart believes and my head doesn't. And that sort of remains my position. But I'm sort of interested in the whole cultural aspect of ghosts and the storytelling aspect of ghosts, and how people interact with the whole idea of ghost stories.
Absolutely. I mean, as you say, for a folklorist, it doesn't actually matter, does it, whether ghosts exist or not? What's of interest to us is those experiences that people are having, why they have them, and why often shared experiences across long periods.
And the kind of emotional resonance of it, and occasionally intellectual resonance of it. That for me is far more interesting. And I kind of get slightly annoyed when people use paranormal and supernatural as synonyms, because they're completely different. They mean completely different things. Yeah. So a lot of people call themselves paranormalists are in fact supernaturalists, and it's very important to understand the difference.
Yes, it really is. Now, the subtitle of your book is 500 Years of Hunting for Proof. Okay. Yes. Now, walk us through very, very briefly what you're covering across the chapters in this book, across that kind of 500-year period.
Okay, so the first thing to say is the subtitle was slightly imposed on me by my editor, and I kind of went along with it. So it's not my idea, that subtitle, but it sort of serves its purpose. It slightly positions the book. What I wanted to look at, and I go into detail in the book, which is number one, and I realized this at an early age, and in fact corresponded with Peter Underwood about it, that there are clearly different kinds of ghosts. I think I come up with about 8 in the book, but I think there are actually more than that. I've come up with about 12. And so if you say, do ghosts exist? You have to say, well, what kind of ghost? What are we talking about? Is it a sort of traditional apparition? Is it a sort of stone tape? Is it a poltergeist? Is it a sort of elemental demonic? All these different subsections. Is it an animal ghost? Is it a ghost of an inanimate object like a car or a bus. There's so many. Is it a sort of a sort of ghost which has, well, it's sort of repeating ghost, a stone tape. Anyway, all those different categories. Yeah, so I tried to look at it, and I realised also what ghosts were and what people wanted from ghosts, which is a very important thing. What do people want from a ghost? Which kind of changed, and you can see it quite clearly, the change in what ghosts do in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century. They seem to have a different function. They seem to do different things, appear in different kind of places. So I got very interested in that, and their origins in a kind of religious sphere, and then the eclipse of Catholicism, and then the resurgence of Catholic emancipation in the 18th century, and the various emancipation acts, and that which corresponded with the rise of Gothic fiction, and how so much of the British experience of ghosts was just a fear of resurgent Catholicism that people were afraid of. It wasn't actually a spectre coming out of the tomb, it was actually the Catholic Church.
Yes. The fear wasn't always of the supernatural, that was just how it manifested. Yeah. Now, you cover some quite well-known cases in this book, so I'm just scanning down the contents page, and obviously you have like the Brown Lady of Rainham Hall is a very well-known case. And I know you touch upon the Screaming Skull at Bettiscombe Manor.
Yes, which I've actually held in my hand. Well, I mean the box, not the actual skull.
Yes.
Bettiscombe, yeah.
There's some great stories there, but you do cover a very broad range of lesser known stories as well, didn't you? How did you go about collecting and choosing what to include in this?
Well, one of the things I did is I read up all of the kind of academic work being done on, the Tedworth drama and the Ghost of Mrs. Veal, and so I absolutely acknowledge it in the book how beholden I am to all sorts of academics for basically teasing all this material out of sources. And suddenly there was some kind of point about 20 years ago where the folkloric became an acceptable subject of study. And I kind of felt that all this work had been done by these amazing academics, but it hadn't necessarily translated to a public sphere. And I felt part of my job was to translate some of this research in academia, into a sort of popular way of, into a language that people can understand, and with a sort of love and understanding of spooky stuff, which maybe academics a bit, in my experience, a little bit worried about, and I had no qualms about going for it. And I've become quite friendly with a number of academics since. And so I'm very proud of that. And I've always acknowledged my debt to them and the help they give me. And it's been quite a congenial relationship.
But although you're using a lot of academic sources, your material is written in a far more accessible way, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, you're pitching this very much at a kind of lay audience.
Well, and a lot of academics can't write very well. I mean, they can, and it's, they're not very necessarily all that. And a lot of, if you read PhDs and so forth, or if you've written one, they're very almost like legalese. They're, everything has to be, inflected everything has to be accounted for. Yes. So you can't do any flights of fancy. You can't say anything a bit mad or a bit expressive, which is in fact what people like about, Gothic and ghost stories and folklore.
Yes. Oh yeah,
it's
absolutely.
A bit mad, So I just felt I was kind of unleashing these stories, and there'd also been so much work and digital work on, newspaper sources, which again had not really, when I wrote the book in, about 2010 onwards, was not really all that well known. I mean, it's now much better known,
Mm.
but all these amazing newspaper archives, and just all the stuff about these kind of mobs, these ghost mobs in Victorian London, and sort of 5,000 people turning up in a churchyard. And I just thought, what? How does no one know about this? This is absolutely astonishing.
Oh yeah. There's some real kind of gold, isn't there, in those old stories as well. Have you got any particular favourites? I mean, you cover a lot of ground in this book.
Well, I think my favourite one is Mrs. Manning, who was the famous murderess, and just people turning up in the outside the house and looking at her. Anyway, the famous French murderess. I think that's a favourite, but every now and again I sort of find myself walking past St. Giles or something, and I suddenly remember, oh yes, a ghost mob turned up there and kind of pounced on someone. It turned out to be a distressed mother guarding the grave of her son from resurrectionists.
Yes, yeah.
Or the kind of Hammersmith ghost, which was just a poor bricklayer who was wearing white clothes and had been warned about it and was murdered. Because people get a bit sort of they kind of, the whole Cock Lane ghost and the sort of relationship between alcohol, intoxication and so forth in ghosts is quite interesting. I didn't really write about that much, but I did a sort of extra thing about the Cock Lane ghost in the Fortean Times, which, if I do a future edition, if I'm asked to kind of revise the book, I'll put in. I discovered that there'd been a kind of gay sex scandal about 2 doors down just a few months earlier, which the king knew about, and just the way that this idea of and the whole Bartholomew Fair and this idea of social disorder was very interesting. And you get that a bit with the ghost mobs too, and how much the city authorities feared these kind of mobs of really well-oiled, merry people. I mean, basically going out on a ghost hunt. And things are not all that different now, really. It's just a matter of scale.
Yes, it is, and the way that these things are covered as well, isn't it? And you do address that as well towards the end of the book, where you talk about kind of technological stories, for example, and to TV investigation of the paranormal.
Well, there's always been this absolutely, well, at least it's certainly from the 18th century, this absolutely irreducible connection to technology with ghosts, and the way ghost photography, recording machines, but all those sort of 18th century sort of magical shows using illusion and so forth, and Pepper's Ghost a bit later, and people sort of wanted to be fooled and entertained. And then, almost as soon as photography was invented, it was, or indeed, cinematography and film, its ghostliness was immediately understood. And again, very interesting. And one of the first, reviews of moving pictures in sort of 1890s Russia was sort of preoccupied with how one day all these people will be dead, and yet what we're seeing are their sort of ghosts before the fact. And so that was almost like one of the first ever reviews of a film, was immediately talking about the ghostliness. And I talk a bit about I talk a bit in my book about this sort of very interesting period in the 1890s where in London you've got sort of modern cinema and X-rays almost like vying for customers. So which is why you get some of these very early films which are often about skeletons and headlessness, acephaly. And when you realize that that the originally X-rays were really a form of entertainment, and with, I mean, it sounds ludicrous now, but and there was this sort of strange bleeding between, you know, the idea of the skeleton and the film and the X-ray, and people would literally move through these extremely powerful, crude X-rays, and so they could see each other's skeletons moving. I mean, this was, you know, and there's literally like a few months in the history of cinema where you can see moving pictures treating X-rays as a rival, you know, and just bringing on the skeletons.
And it's you have to wonder, don't you, whether some of the things that we find these days as entertainment are going to be seen in such a bizarre way in 100 years' time to the way that we look back at things as being entertainment.
But also at that same period, the invention of radio, and how unbelievably freaky it was hearing voices from the ether.
Yes.
In a way that we can't even begin to understand. It was sort of terrifying and horrifying, and it seemed to prove, kind of ghost for a while, that, you know, you could just pick up signals, and this idea of mental radio was very powerful right up into the sort of 1920s. If you could just tune your mind, you would pick up these etheric signals.
And of course, some of these technologies and some of these techniques are used now by those who identify as paranormal investigators, for example. And you do cover in the last chapter of the book that kind of paranormal investigation as entertainment phenomenon. Now, I mean, I don't want to particularly name any one program or any one style. There are plenty of them these days, after all.
Yes.
But do you think that that whole aspect brings anything positive to this field? And if so, what does it bring?
I do worry increasingly. I mean, to begin with, it was quite innocent, but I do worry increasingly about the commercialization of it, and also quite often people being taken into what are actually quite unsafe environments. So, you know, damaged and falling down buildings, and also this obsession with sort of asylums and prisons I find really bizarre, you know, but it's all part of this sort of gothic aspect of it. I mean, I do feel that, you know, I was just thinking of when these various acts of parliament came in to deal with fraudulent mediums, because it was felt that they were taking advantage of the bereaved. And sometimes, I don't think we're quite there yet, but there is an aspect of some of these very commercial shows that are big money spinners. They're sort of taking advantage of people, and that does worry me. But I mean, if it's just sort of almost like Halloween fun, which is kind of what it proposes itself to be, then why not? I've always been very careful never to criticize ghost hunting, but sometimes I do think that it doesn't, you know, it's not quite honest about what it's doing. It's not trying to prove that ghosts exist. You know, you can't prove that ghosts exist with a photograph or a video. You know, it's just ridiculous. You know, I think people need to stop thinking that.
Yeah, I guess if it's treated in the way that it's intended by some people, so that's as entertainment in whatever format. Yeah. I mean, dark tourism these days is a form of entertainment. Ghost hunting is definitely entertainment.
Well, there's a legal obligation.
Yeah.
I mean, as you know, I'm sure you know, there's a legal obligation by Ofcom to, you know, say this is for entertainment, this isn't real.
Yes.
And so at one point I was going to go on one of the weekend morning shows to talk about my book, and quite a famous one. I won't mention which one, but it was a very famous one. And they kept humming and hawing, and in the end they were actually so worried that they were going to breach Ofcom rules that they wouldn't let me on. I kept trying to explain to them, look, I've got nothing to peddle. I'm just a sort of cheerful, skeptical believer. I'm interested in people, the people aspect of ghosts, but they were really terrified about Ofcom and getting censored.
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? But to my mind, the one positive to take from it is that it keeps interest in the field alive.
That's yes, and it's sort of, and I admire the sort of imaginative process that it's sort of one of the few things in the world at the moment which is about imagination, you know, and sort of feelings but yes, I just wish sometimes that people did a bit more kind of reading on the subject, you know.
Yeah.
And I do notice, and as a sort of film critic for 20 years, that most people get nearly all their information about ghosts from Hollywood movies, and they repeat all this stuff with absolute certainty that this is sort of established,
Yeah.
you know, well, not exactly truth, but this is what everyone believes in, and that's actually not at all.
And that leads me on actually to the last point that I wanted to cover, which is that obviously the majority of this book is looking at recorded cases of alleged hauntings, the way they were presented, the way they were investigated, and so on. But then right in the middle of the book, you have a chapter called "The Ritual of the Ghost Story," which also kind of looks at that kind of crossover, doesn't it, between writing of ghost stories and the kind of, you know, investigation of alleged stories that the rest of the book is looking at. Where do you see that crossover between the non-fiction aspect of the ghost story and the fictionalized aspect lying?
Well, I think, I mean, almost the sort of the whole idea of M.R. James hurriedly writing a ghost story at Christmas for his friends or the choristers at King's or whatever, is actually sort of a beloved thing. And it's funny that it's round about the same time, I mean, just before World War One, a little bit after, where there was quite a lot of sort of thinking about, there was like a last gasp of spiritualism, and there was all these people, because of the horrors of World War One, you know, wanting to communicate with their dead, and M.R. James, like everyone, was very traumatized by the death toll, and he was never quite the same after World War One. But and I just think of all those sort of Cambridge and you know, public school authors like Benson and so forth, and they created a sort of cozy thing. It's almost like a sort of, it's now so established in our culture, and it's now so exported everywhere, you know, including Japan, and that there's a sort of coziness to it, and the whole idea of, you know, oh, why do people like to be frightened and everything, which is sort of endlessly diverting. And what is it about ghost stories in the UK and Christmas? And you look at it, and it actually goes back a very long way, and you know, and you even see Pepys, you know, having the drummer of Tedworth being read to him on Christmas Day, and you know, it goes back even further than that. So it seems to be very established in England, this idea of coziness, fireplaces, you know, warmth, friendship. I think friendship is very important, and that's also again what M.R. James was very good at understanding.
Yes. Yeah.
And so I mean, obviously that's very different from careering around graveyards and asylums, trying to record things. But yeah, I mean, I don't know what else to say really. I mean, that's.
No, it's a long established tradition, as you say, isn't it? I mean, you know, I mean, Shakespeare refers to A Winter's Tale, which is, after all, you know, that is A Winter's Tale is a story of sprites and goblins, as it says.
Yeah.
Text. And I think
exactly.
Yeah.
Which of course M.R. James picked up. Yes.
Yeah, and I think that idea of you know, the rituals around writing those against the rituals of the ghost haunting is an interesting cross.
Well, I think so much about this is about exposition and about, so what people's favorite kind of ghost stories is that an event will happen, a ghostly event will happen, and then someone will go and dig up something or find in an archive something that completely proves it, and people absolutely love that. It's very satisfying, and the whole idea of exposition is so interesting. I think if you're a writer, I mean, one is always dealing with exposition, and then you get to people like Robert Aikman, who can almost sort of do away with it and somehow manage this sort of balancing act of almost not needing exposition or having a weird relationship with exposition. But
yeah, it's an endlessly fascinating subject. I think that's the thing, and there is such a breadth of work to draw on that, you know, even a book such as yours with the subtitle foisted on you as it might have been 500
yes.
it really can only ever touch the surface of what this is looking into, isn't it? But look, you know, the back of your book has, for example, The Guardian saying a highly enjoyable (brackets and disturbing close brackets) work. A literary review saying lively and absorbing. It's no surprise that this book was first published in 2012.
Yeah.
And is still easily available to buy, whereas a lot of ghost books come and go very quickly. In fact, also available as an ebook, I think, isn't it?
Is it? And large print, and the one thing it isn't is a Audible book, so that surprises me. But maybe, who knows? Maybe in the future
you'll have to find out who owns the rights, you or them.
But yeah, I was always surprised. It was just in that period about 2012 where the audiobook hadn't really taken off, and it just sort of missed out. But who knows? Maybe.
Yeah. But I think that is the most telling aspect, is the fact that after 8 years and counting, A Natural History of Ghosts is still in print and is still available to buy, and I would highly recommend anybody to go and find a copy. My thanks to Roger for taking the time to join me and talk about his fascinating book. A Natural History of Ghosts is published by Penguin Books, and I've put links down in the show description below so that you can go off and order yourself a copy if you do not already have one. I would highly recommend it. Many thanks for joining me. Please remember that all of the Folklore Podcast and Folklore Podcast Book Club content is completely free to listen to watch and to enjoy. If you'd like to support us in this venture to keep this content going, then do please consider visiting our Patreon page, where you can find exclusive extra content for a small monthly donation, or visiting our website at www.thefolklorepodcast.com, where you can make a one-off donation. If you're not able to assist us financially, that's absolutely fine. Do please just share our content on your favourite social media platforms, so that you can bring in new audiences to enjoy the programming that we put out. Thanks very much for watching. I look forward to seeing you all again soon.